There are promises made in moments of desperation that history stubbornly refuses to release. In the spring of 1848, among the cotton rows of southern Louisiana, a man named Augustus Thornwell stood over another man who lay dying in the dirt. The dying man spoke 7 words before his final breath slipped away. Augustus laughed. He laughed so hard his shoulders trembled. 3 months later, Augustus Thornwell was discovered dead in his bedroom. Dressed in his wedding suit, his face locked in an expression so unsettling that the undertaker refused to remain alone with the body. The local newspaper dismissed it as a tragic failure of the heart. His fiancée fled Louisiana that same night and never spoke his name again. The servants who found him never entered that room for the rest of their lives. What happened during those 3 months was buried in private correspondence, medical notes, and sworn statements that were never made public until now. Before we continue with the story of Augustus Thornwell and the words that may have ended his life, I invite you to subscribe to this channel if you're drawn to stories that blur the boundary between documented history and true horror. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? Let's uncover together whether these dark chapters of American history unfolded near where you live. The event set in motion that spring would consume not only Augustus Thornwell, but everyone bound to him. Unraveling secrets a prominent Louisiana family had concealed for generations. Belle Rive Parish in southern Louisiana was not a large community in 1848, but it was a wealthy one. The parish rested along a slow, dark bend of the Mississippi River, its surface reflecting moss-draped oak trees that crowded the banks. Around 2,000 people lived within its borders, nearly half of them enslaved, laboring on the cotton and sugarcane plantations that made men like Augustus Thornwell unimaginably rich. Augustus was 28 that spring, the only son of the late William Thornwell, who had transformed the Thornwell Plantation into one of the most profitable estates in the region. When his father died of yellow fever in 1845, Augustus inherited everything: the land, the manor house with its white columns and sweeping verandas, the reputation, and the heavy responsibility of preserving it all. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair he kept meticulously groomed, and a smile he wielded like a blade during business dealings. Those who knew him said he possessed his father's charm, but none of his father's restraint. The Thornwell estate covered nearly 800 acres. The main house sat at the end of a long drive lined with live oaks, a 2-story structure with tall windows that captured the morning light. Behind it stretched the fields, endless rows of cotton that turned white in late summer, and beyond them stood the quarters, where the enslaved workers lived in rough wooden cabins built decades earlier by Augustus's grandfather. In 1848, 43 people were enslaved on the Thornwell Plantation. Augustus knew their names the way he knew the names of his horses, not as individuals, but as property, investments, tools that required upkeep. Among the 43 was a man named Samuel. He was 36 years old, though he appeared far older. Years of labor under the Louisiana sun had etched deep lines into his face and bent his back. Samuel had been born on the Thornwell land. His mother died when he was young, and his father was sold away when Samuel was 12. He never saw him again. Samuel was known as reliable and quiet, a man who kept his eyes lowered and his thoughts unspoken. He had a wife named Ruth and 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6. They lived in one of the cabins closest to the fields. That spring, Augustus Thornwell was preparing for the most important event in his life, his wedding. He was engaged to Catherine Beaumont, the daughter of Judge Harold Beaumont, whose plantation bordered the Thornwell estate to the north. Catherine was 23, educated in Charleston, refined in all the ways that mattered in Louisiana society. She played the piano, spoke fluent French, and carried herself with the effortless confidence of someone who had never known deprivation. The marriage would bind 2 of the most powerful families in Belle Rive Parish. The wedding was scheduled for June 20th, the Saturday before the summer solstice, when the days were longest and the gardens would be heavy with bloom. Augustus threw himself into the preparations with a fervor that surprised even his closest associates. He ordered new furniture from New Orleans, had the manor repainted, and commissioned a gown from a Baton Rouge seamstress for Catherine that cost more than most families earned in a year. He hired musicians from as far away as Mobile, planned a feast for 200 guests, and had a gazebo constructed in the garden solely for the ceremony. Everything had to be flawless. Everything had to proclaim that Augustus Thornwell was not merely wealthy, but a man of ambition, a man destined to shape the future of Belleroy Parish. But perfection demanded control, and control demanded discipline. Augustus managed his plantation as his father had taught him, with a velvet touch for obedience and bare iron for defiance. He believed the enslaved needed to understand their place, that any hint of resistance or laziness had to be crushed immediately before it spread to the quarters like infection. Samuel understood this completely. He had lived beneath this system his entire life. He knew when to avert his gaze, when to say, "Yes, sir," when to move quickly, and when to vanish from sight. He survived by being invisible, by becoming exactly what was expected of him. But in the spring of 1848, something shifted. It began with Samuel's daughter. Her name was Grace, and she fell ill in late March. At first, it seemed like an ordinary fever, the kind that swept through the quarters every spring when the weather turned warm and damp. But Grace's fever did not break. It rose higher. She stopped eating. Her skin burned beneath the touch, and she began suffering seizures that left her weak and disoriented. Ruth pleaded with the overseer, a man named Dalton, to send for a doctor. Dalton said he would speak to Mr. Thornwell. Augustus refused. He said physicians were costly, and that it was likely nothing more than swamp fever that would pass on its own. He instructed Dalton to give Ruth some willow bark tea and keep the child in the cabin until she recovered. Samuel went to the main house himself, hat clutched in his hands, and asked Augustus directly. He explained that Grace was worsening, that she needed real help, that he would work longer hours, anything. If Mr. Thornwell would just send for a doctor. Augustus looked at Samuel for a long moment. Then he said, "Your girl will be fine. Children fall ill. They recover. Now get back to work before I have Dalton remind you what happens to people who waste my time." Samuel returned to the fields. Grace died 4 days later, on April 3rd, 1848. She died in her mother's arms, her small body racked with violent convulsions, her fever so intense that Ruth later said her daughter's skin felt like touching a hot stove. The cause was almost certainly scarlet fever, though no physician ever examined her confirm it. Samuel and Ruth buried their daughter in the small plot behind the quarters where other enslaved people were laid to rest, marked only by simple wooden crosses that would rot away within a few years. Samuel did not speak for 3 days after Grace died. He went out to fields, completed his work, and returned to his cabin without a word. Ruth was frightened, not by Samuel's grief, but by what that grief might turn into. She knew sorrow could harden into anger, and anger could get a man killed. She begged him to hold on, to think of their son, to survive. Samuel nodded, but his eyes had changed. Something inside them had gone cold, distant, unreachable. The incident that led to that spring day occurred on April 18th, 15 days after Grace's death. Augustus was inspecting the field with Dalton, discussing planting schedules and projected yields for the coming season. He was in excellent spirits. Catherine had just sent word that her wedding dress had arrived from Baton Rouge, and the invitations had been printed and were already being delivered to prominent families across 3 parishes. Augustus was envisioning his wedding day, the admiration of his guests, the public celebration of his status, the beginning of his life as a married man, an unquestioned patriarch. They came upon Samuel working in the far field near the tree line, where cultivated land dissolved into swamp. Samuel was moving slowly, his motion stiff and mechanical, his expression blank. Dalton noticed it first. He called out to Samuel, ordering him to work faster. Samuel didn't respond. Dalton walked closer and repeated the command. Samuel looked up, and for a brief moment there was something in his eyes, a flash of defiance, of rage, of something that refused to remain invisible any longer. Dalton struck him across the face with the back of his hand. It was a casual blow, the sort of violence so routine on plantations that it barely registered as an event. But Samuel did not lower his gaze. He stared at Dalton, then shifted his eyes to Augustus, who was watching from only a few feet away. "My daughter died," Samuel said. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the field. "She died because you wouldn't help her." The words hung in the air. Dalton's face flushed red. Augustus's expression remained composed, but his eyes narrowed. This was a moment that could not be ignored. If Samuel were allowed to speak this way, to challenge a white man, to assign blame to his master, it would undermine everything. Other enslaved workers were nearby. They had heard. This had to be addressed immediately, decisively. "Your daughter died because God willed it," Augustus said calmly, his voice cold and precise. "And if you ever speak to me that way again, you'll join her." Samuel took a step forward. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it was enough. Dalton seized him, and two other overseers who had been working nearby ran over. They forced Samuel to the ground. Augustus stood with his arms crossed as they bound Samuel's hands behind his back. What followed was not unusual for that time or place. Samuel was punished. The punishment was severe, brutal enough to serve as a warning, a reminder to everyone in the quarters of what happened when you forgot your place. The details do not need to be described here, but the outcome was unmistakable. Samuel was left broken, bleeding, and barely conscious in the dirt of the field where he had been working. Augustus stood over him as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The other enslaved workers had been ordered back to their tasks, but Augustus knew they were watching from the edges of their vision. He needed to speak, to turn this moment into a lesson that would be remembered. "You brought this on yourself," Augustus said, looking down at Samuel. "You forgot what you are. Let this remind you." Samuel's eyes opened. They were unfocused, clouded with pain, but they found Augustus's face. His lips moved. At first, no sound emerged. Then, with an effort that seemed to drain the last of his strength, Samuel spoke. His voice was a rasp, barely audible, but Augustus heard every word. "You will not see your wedding day." 7 words. Simple, direct, a statement, not a threat, not a supernatural curse, but a prediction, a promise, a final act of defiance from a man who had nothing left to lose. Augustus stared at him for a moment. Then he laughed. It began as a chuckle and swelled into genuine, unrestrained laughter. He laughed so hard he wiped tears from his eyes. The absurdity of it. The idea that this broken man in the dirt could make pronouncements as if he held any power at all. It was ridiculous. Pathetic. "You hear that, Dalton?" Augustus called out, still laughing. "He says I won't see my wedding day. As if he has any say in the matter. As if God listens to the prayers of people like him." Dalton forced a laugh in response, though it sounded uneasy. Augustus turned and walked away, still chuckling, shaking his head at the foolishness of it all. Samuel died that night. His body finally gave out, from the injuries, from the heat, from the accumulated weight of 36 years of bondage. Ruth found him in the cabin when she returned from the main house, where she worked in the kitchen. He lay on the rough wooden floor, his eyes open, one hand reaching toward the corner where Grace's small bed had once been. Ruth did not cry. She had no tears left. She closed Samuel's eyes, covered his body with a blanket, and sat beside him until morning. When Dalton came to check on him, she told him Samuel was dead. Dalton nodded, made a note in his ledger, one less worker, a financial loss for Mr. Thornwell, and arranged for the body to be buried beside Grace. Augustus was informed of Samuel's death during breakfast. He nodded, expressed mild irritation at the inconvenience, and returned to reading a letter from Catherine detailing the final arrangements for their wedding. He never thought about Samuel again. Why? Would he? The man was gone. The matter was finished. Life went on. But 3 days later, on April 21st, Augustus woke in the middle of the night with a violent pain in his chest. It felt as if a red-hot iron had been pressed directly against his sternum. He jolted upright in bed, gasping, one hand clutching his chest. The pain lasted perhaps 30 seconds, then slowly receded. Augustus lay back against the pillows, his heart hammering, and told himself it was nothing. Indigestion from the heavy dinner he'd eaten that evening, stress from the wedding arrangements, the oppressive heat. He mentioned it to no one. Then it happened again 2 nights later. And then again, and again. The first time Augustus saw Samuel, he convinced himself it had been a dream. It was April 27th, 9 days after Samuel's death. Augustus had been working late in his study, reviewing plantation accounts. The room sat on the second floor of the manor house, its tall windows overlooking the front drive and the live oaks beyond. It was well past midnight. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant chorus of frogs rising from the swamp. By then, the chest pains were coming almost every night. Sharp, sudden, leaving him breathless and drenched in sweat. He had begun keeping a bottle of whiskey in the study, pouring himself a glass when the pain struck, telling himself it helped. That night, he had just poured his second drink when he heard footsteps in the hallway outside his door. They were slow, deliberate steps, the sound of someone walking with difficulty, one foot dragging slightly behind the other. Augustus looked up from his papers. The house should have been empty, aside from servants asleep in their quarters behind the main house. He rose, crossed the door, and opened it. The hallway was dark. The single candle he had left burning on the hall table had gone out, though there was no draft. Augustus stepped into the corridor, lifting his own candle high. "Who was there?" he called. There was no answer. At the far end of the hallway, near the stairs, he saw a shadow. It had the unmistakable shape of a man standing still, facing him. I said, "Who's there?" Augustus called again, his voice sharper now, edged with irritation, and something else he refused to name. The shadow did not move. Augustus walked toward it, his candle throwing restless light across the walls. As he approached, the shadow seemed to retreat, backing slowly toward the stairs. His irritation flared into anger. If one of the servants had entered the house without permission, there would be consequences. He reached the top of the staircase. The shadow was gone. Augustus stood there, breathing hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He stared down into the darkened foyer below. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. He returned to his study, locked the door, and finished a bottle of whiskey. When he finally fell asleep slumped in his chair, he dreamed of the field, of Samuel lying in the dirt, of those 7 words spoken in a voice that seemed to rise from deep underground. By morning, Augustus told himself it had been the whiskey, the stress, his imagination. He threw himself into the wedding preparations with renewed urgency, as if constant motion might keep the darkness at bay. But the incidents did not stop. On May 2nd, Augustus was riding along the property line, inspecting the fences. It was mid-afternoon, the sun high and punishing. He dismounted to examine a section of rail that needed repair when his horse suddenly reared, eyes rolling white, nostrils flaring in panic. Augustus grabbed the reins, trying to calm the animal, but it was terrified of something unseen. It jerked free, nearly trampling him, and bolted back toward the stables. Augustus stood alone on the empty road. He scanned the fields, searching for what had frightened the horse. Cotton plants stretched out on either side, still small and green. About 50 yards away, the tree line rose in a dark wall of cypress and oak, heavy with Spanish moss. And there at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the shadows, stood a figure, a man, watching him. Augustus's breath caught in his throat. He stepped forward, squinting against the glare of the sun. The figure did not move. "You there?" Augustus called. "Come here." The figure turned and walked into the trees, disappearing beneath the canopy. Augustus ran after it. He crashed through the undergrowth, branches snapping and whipping against his face, boots sinking into soft, sucking ground. He ran for nearly 2 minutes, lungs burning, until he burst into a small clearing. It was empty, only trees, dark water, and the sound of his own ragged breathing. He walked back to the road slowly, clothes torn, hands scratched and bleeding from the branches. When he reached the stables, his horse was there, still trembling, foam clinging to its mouth. A stable hand looked at him with concern and asked if he was all right. "Fine," Augustus said. The horse spooked. "That's all." But he wasn't fine. That night, the chest pain returned worse than ever. And when he finally slept, he dreamed of Samuel's face, of eyes staring up from the dirt, of lips moving again and again, forming the same 7 words. The servants began to notice changes in Augustus. He was short-tempered, snapping over the smallest mistakes. Dark circles settled beneath his eyes. He drank more, no longer just at night, but during the day. He would stand at the manor windows for long stretches, staring out over the fields, his expression distant and unsettled. Catherine noticed as well. She visited on May 10th, 3 weeks after Samuel's death, to discuss final wedding details. She found Augustus in the parlor, unshaven, clothes rumpled, a glass of whiskey in his hand despite the early hour. It was barely 2 in the afternoon. "Augustus, are you ill?" she asked, concern filling her voice. "No," he replied quickly. "Just tired. The preparations, there's so much to manage." Catherine sat beside him and took his hand. "You look exhausted. Perhaps you should see Dr. Whitfield. He could give you something to help you sleep." Augustus pulled his hand away. "I don't need a doctor. I'm fine." But he wasn't fine, and Catherine could see it. She left that afternoon with a sense of unease she couldn't fully explain. There was something in him now, something restless, something shadowed that had not been there before. Augustus's eyes held something new now, a haunted look, a fear he was desperately trying to conceal. That night, May 10th, Augustus woke to find someone standing at the foot of his bed. The room was dark, but enough moonlight filtered to the window for him to make out the silhouette. A man, tall and thin, his posture bent, as if his body were in constant pain. He stood perfectly still, watching. Augustus's heart thundered in his chest. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He lay frozen, staring at the figure. Then the figure spoke. The voice was soft, hoarse, but unmistakable. "You will not see your wedding day." Augustus screamed. He lunged out of bed, snatched a candlestick from a nightstand, and swung it with all his strength. The metal passed through empty air. The figure vanished. Augustus stood alone in his bedroom, gasping, the candlestick shaking in his grip. He lit every candle in the room. He checked the door. It was locked from the inside. He checked the windows, closed, latched, undisturbed. There was no way anyone could have entered. No way anyone could have left. He did not sleep again that night. He sat in a chair by the window, the candlestick resting across his knees, eyes fixed on the door, waiting for dawn. Augustus told no one what he had seen. How could he? If he admitted he was seeing things, hearing voices, people would think he was losing his mind. And if word spread that Augustus Thornwell was unstable, everything could collapse. The wedding, his reputation, his business ties. So he stayed silent and told himself it was stress, exhaustion, some passing illness. But the incidents didn't stop. They escalated. On May 14th, Augustus dined with Judge Beaumont and Catherine at the Beaumont estate. It was meant to be a pleasant evening, a final gathering before the wedding. The conversation was light. Weather, the cotton crop, share acquaintances. Augustus tried to focus, tried to be charming, but his attention kept slipping. His thoughts drifted. He would find himself staring into space, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth, until Catherine gently touched his arm to bring him back. At one point during the meal, Augustus looked up and saw Samuel standing in the corner of the dining room. He wore the same clothes he had died in, torn, dirt-stained. His face was bruised. His eyes were fixed on Augustus. No one else seemed to notice him. Judge Beaumont, continued talking about the coming harvest. Catherine laughed at something her father said, and Samuel stood there, silent, watching. Augustus dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against the plate. "Are you all right, son?" Judge Beaumont asked. Augustus looked back at the corner. It was empty. "Yes," Augustus said, his voice tight. "I'm sorry. I thought I saw it's nothing. I'm fine." But Catherine was watching him closely. Worry etched across her face. After dinner, she pulled him aside in the garden. "Augustus, please tell me what's wrong," she said. "You're not yourself. You haven't been for weeks." He wanted to tell her. He wanted to confess everything, the chest pains, the shadows, the voice in his bedroom. But he couldn't. If he did, she might cancel the wedding. Her father might decide Augustus was unfit, unstable, a dangerous match. "I'm just tired," he said, forcing a smile. "Once the wedding is over and we're settled, everything will be better. I promise." Catherine didn't look convinced, but she nodded. "All right, but please take care of yourself. I need you to be well." Augustus kissed her hand and left. On the ride back to his estate, he saw Samuel 3 more times, one standing at the side of the road, one staring from the window of a cabin as Augustus passed the quarters, and once in the reflection of a puddle, looking up at him from the dark water. By the time Augustus reached the manor house, he was shaking so badly he could barely dismount his horse. The servants began to whisper among themselves. They noticed that Mr. Thornwell looked ill, that he barely ate, that he sometimes stopped mid-sentence while giving an order and stared at nothing, his face drained of color. Some said he was haunted, that Samuel's spirit had returned for revenge. Others said it was guilt, that Mr. Thornwell's conscience had finally caught up with him. Ruth heard the whispers. She said nothing, but there was a grim satisfaction in her eyes. She had never forgiven Augustus for letting Grace die, for killing Samuel. If he was suffering now, she believed it was no more than he deserved. On May 18th, 1 month after Samuel's death, Augustus went to see Dr. Whitfield. He resisted the idea, but the chest pains had become unbearable, and he was barely sleeping. He needed help, even if it meant admitting weakness. Dr. Whitfield was a portly man in his 50s, with a gentle face and a calm, reassuring manner. He examined Augustus carefully, listened to his heart, checked his pulse, asked detailed questions about his symptoms. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied Augustus thoughtfully. "Your heart sounds strong," Dr. Whitfield said. "Your pulse is elevated, but that could be stress. Tell me, have you been under unusual strain lately?" Augustus almost laughed. Unusual strain. The wedding, Augustus said instead. There's a great deal to manage. Dr. Whitfield nodded. Wedding preparations can certainly be stressful, but I suspect there's more at play. You look exhausted. Augustus, when was the last time you slept through the night? Augustus couldn't remember. It's been difficult, he admitted. Any other symptoms? The doctor asked. Anxiety? Disturbing thoughts. Augustus hesitated. This was the moment. He could tell him everything. The visions, the voice, the figure standing in his bedroom. But what would the doctor think? What would he do? No, Augustus said at last. Just the chest pains. And the sleeplessness. Dr. Whitfield prescribed laudanum to help him rest and advised him to avoid excessive work and worry. Augustus took the prescription and left, knowing rest was impossible. How could he rest when every time he closed his eyes, he saw Samuel's face? That night, Augustus took a dose of laudanum and went to bed early. The drug dragged him into a heavy, unnatural sleep. But at some point in the night, he woke, or thought he did. The room was dark. He couldn't move. His body felt paralyzed, pinned to the mattress by an invisible weight, and standing beside the bed, leaning over him, was Samuel. Samuel's face hovered inches from his own. Augustus could see every detail. The bruises, the cuts, the dark streaks of dry blood. Samuel's eyes were open, fixed on him, unblinking. His lips moved, whispering the same 7 words again and again. You will not see your wedding day. You will not see your wedding day. You will not see your wedding day. Augustus tried to scream, but no sound came out. He tried to move, but his body refused to obey. He lay helpless as the whisper filled his ears, filled his thoughts, until it was the only thing he could hear, the only thing that existed. Then, suddenly, the paralysis broke. Augustus bolted upright, gasping, his body drenched in sweat. The room was empty. Samuel was gone, but the whisper lingered, echoing in his mind, refusing to fade. Augustus did not sleep again that night, or the next after that. By late May, Augustus Thornwell was a shadow of the man he had been just 2 months earlier. He had lost weight, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. He moved through Manor House like a ghost himself, flinching at every sound, staring too long at every shadow. The wedding was less than 3 weeks away. The preparations were nearly complete. The food ordered, the musicians hired, the guests confirmed. Everything was ready, except Augustus. Catherine came to visit on May 24th and was shocked by his appearance. She insisted he see Dr. Whitfield again, but Augustus refused. He knew the doctor could not help him. This was not a medical problem. This was something else, something medicine could not touch. Augustus, please, Catherine begged. You're frightening me. What's happening to you? For a moment, he almost told her everything. The chest pains, the shadows, the voice in the night. But then he imagined her reaction, the horror, the disbelief, the inevitable conclusion that he had lost his mind. He couldn't bear it. I'm fine, he said, though his voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. Just a few more weeks, and everything will be perfect. You'll see. Catherine was not convinced. That evening, she spoke with her father, sharing her fears. Judge Beaumont was troubled. He had noticed Augustus's decline as well, and had begun to wonder if the marriage should be postponed. But the invitations had already been sent, the arrangements made. Calling off the wedding now would create scandal, an embarrassment to both families. Give him a little more time, Judge Beaumont said at last. Perhaps he'll recover once the wedding is over and the pressure is gone. Catherine reluctantly agreed, though her unease only deepened. Meanwhile, strange things were happening at the Thornwell estate. Servants reported hearing footsteps in empty rooms, doors opening and closing on their own, cold patches of air drifting through the house even on warm nights. One kitchen maid swore she saw a figure standing in the garden at dawn, watching the house. When she looked again, it was gone. Ruth heard these stories while working in the kitchen. She said nothing, but she knew Samuel had not left. She could feel his presence, a cold, simmering anger that seeped through the house like smoke. She wondered if Augustus felt it too, if that was why he looked so hollowed and afraid. On May 28th, Augustus received a letter. It was delivered by a writer from New Orleans, a sealed envelope with no return address. Augustus opened it in his study, his hands shaking. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Written in a careful, deliberate hand were 7 words. You will not see your wedding day. Augustus stared at the message, his heart pounding. Who had sent this? Who knew about Samuel's words? He turned the envelope over, searching for some clue, but there was nothing. No name, no mark, no explanation. He crumpled the letter and threw it into the fireplace, watching it burn. But the words were already burned into his mind. He could not escape them. That night, Augustus didn't even attempt to sleep. He sat in his study with every candle lit, a pistol resting on the desk before him. He didn't know what he was defending himself against, but the presence of the weapon made him feel less alone. Sometime after midnight, he heard the footsteps again, slow, dragging, coming down the hallway, toward his study. Augustus grabbed the pistol, his hands slick with sweat. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Who's there? He called, his voice cracking. No answer, only silence. Augustus stood across the room and yanked the door open, pistol raised. The hallway was empty, but on the floor, directly in front of the door, lay a small wooden cross, the kind used to mark graves in the burial plot behind the quarters. Augustus stared at it, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He picked it up with trembling hands. It was rough and hand-carved, the sort of marker that would rot away within a few years, leaving no sign anyone had ever been buried there. He hurled across down the hallway and slammed the door shut, locking it. Backing away, pistol still in hand, he sank into his chair. He was losing his mind. He had to be. There was no other explanation. Samuel was dead. Dead men did not walk the halls, did not leave crosses, did not whisper in the dark. And yet, if this was madness, why did it feel so real? The first week of June brought suffocating heat to Bellerwood Parish. The air hung heavy and wet, pressing down like a soaked blanket. Thunderstorms tore through the afternoons, violent, sudden, leaving the ground steaming and the air even thicker afterward. Augustus barely noticed. He was trapped inside his own private hell, a nightmare he could not wake from. Samuel appeared almost constantly now, in mirrors, in windows, in the shadows beneath trees. Sometimes he only stood and watched. Other times his lips moved silently, shaping those same 7 words, the message unmistakable. Augustus stopped going to fields. He stopped meeting with overseers. He locked himself inside the manor house, moving from room to room, never staying long, as if motion alone might allow him to outrun the thing that followed him. The servants were terrified. They whispered that the house was cursed, that Mr. Thornwell had committed some terrible act, and that he was now being punished for it. Some of them asked to be reassigned to work in the fields, anywhere but the main house. Dalton, the overseer, did his best to maintain order, but even he was unsettled by Augustus's behavior. On June 8th, 12 days before the wedding, Catherine arrived at the estate without warning. She found Augustus in the parlor, sitting in near darkness, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table beside him. "Augustus, this has to stop," she said firmly. "You're destroying yourself. Whatever is wrong, you need to tell me. We're supposed to be married in less than 2 weeks, and I don't even recognize you anymore." Augustus looked at her, and for the first time, he saw fear in her eyes. Not fear of him, but fear for him. Something inside him finally broke. "I'm being haunted," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Catherine stared at him. "What?" "Samuel, the man who died," Augustus said. "He's haunting me. I see him everywhere. I hear his voice. He told me I wouldn't see my wedding day. And I think he was right." Catherine's face drained of color. She sat down slowly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Augustus, that's not possible. You're ill. You need help." "I'm not ill," Augustus snapped, his voice rising. "I know what I've seen. I know what I've heard. He's here, Catherine. He's in this house. He's waiting for me." Catherine stood abruptly. "I'm sending for Dr. Whitfield, and I'm speaking with my father. We need to postpone the wedding until you're well." "No," Augustus said sharply, grabbing her arm. "We can't postpone it. If we do, people will talk. They'll say I'm weak, that I'm mad. I won't let that happen." Catherine pulled her arm free, tears filling her eyes. "I don't care what people say. I care about you. And right now, you need help more than you need a wedding." She left, and Augustus did not try to stop her. He sank back into his chair, lifted the whiskey bottle, and drank until the room spun. Dr. Whitfield arrived the next morning, accompanied by Judge Beaumont. They found Augustus in his bedroom, disheveled and incoherent, muttering about shadows and voices. Dr. Whitfield examined him and concluded that Augustus was suffering from severe nervous exhaustion, likely worsened by excessive drinking. "He needs rest," Dr. Whitfield said gravely. "Complete rest, away from stress or responsibility. I recommend postponing the wedding and having him stay with family or friends until he recovers." Judge Beaumont nodded grimly. "I'll speak with Catherine. We'll make the arrangements." But Augustus, overhearing this, became agitated. "No," he said insistently. "The wedding will happen. It has to. I won't let him win." "Let who win?" Judge Beaumont asked. Augustus did not answer. He turned his face to the wall, jaw clenched. Dr. Whitfield increased the laudanum dosage and instructed that Augustus be closely monitored. Judge Beaumont and Catherine agreed to delay any final decision for a few more days, hoping Augustus might improve. He did not. If anything, he deteriorated further. On June 12th, a servant found Augustus in the garden at dawn, digging frantically in flower beds with his bare hands. His fingers were bloody, his clothes smeared with dirt. When asked what he was doing, Augustus said he was looking for the cross, that he had to find it and destroy it, that it was the only way to make Samuel leave. The servant guided him back inside and alerted Dalton, who sent word to Dr. Whitfield at once. The doctor returned, sedated Augustus, and held a long, serious conversation with Judge Beaumont. I believe Augustus is experiencing a complete nervous collapse, Dr. Whitfield said. He's not in his right mind. He needs to be institutionalized, at least temporarily, until he can recover. Judge Beaumont was horrified. Institutionalization would be a scandal, a permanent stain on the Thornwell name. But he also knew Augustus was a danger to himself. Let me speak with Catherine, Judge Beaumont said quietly. We'll decide what must be done. That evening, Catherine came to see Augustus one last time. He lay in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. She sat beside him and took his hand. Augustus, I love you, she said softly. But I can't marry you like this. Not when you're suffering so badly. We're going to postpone the wedding. You're going to get help. And when you're well, we'll try again. Augustus turned his head to look at her. His eyes were hollow, empty. He was right, he whispered. I won't see my wedding day. Catherine began to cry. Don't say that. You're going to be fine. You just need time. But Augustus shook his head slowly. It's too late. He's already won. Catherine left in tears. She told her father the wedding had to be canceled, that Augustus needed immediate medical intervention. Judge Beaumont agreed and began arranging for Augustus to be sent to an asylum in New Orleans. But they were too late. On the morning of June 19th, the day before Augustus Thornwell's wedding was supposed to take place, the household awoke to an unnatural silence. The servants, accustomed to hearing Augustus moving about at all hours, noticed the manor house was completely still. Ruth arrived early to begin work in the kitchen and felt a chill crawl down her spine. The air inside the house felt wrong, cold and heavy despite the summer heat outside. She went about her duties, but her hands trembled. Around 8 o'clock, Dalton arrived to check on Augustus. Dr. Whitfield had instructed him to keep a close watch, especially after the incident in the garden. Dalton knocked on Augustus's bedroom door. No answer. He knocked again, louder. Still nothing. Dalton tried the handle. The door was locked from the inside. He called Augustus's name. Silence. A sense of dread settled over him. Dalton fetched another servant, and together they forced the door open. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Augustus Thornwell lay on his bed, dressed in his wedding suit. The clothing was immaculate: black coat, white shirt, silk cravat, polished shoes. His hands were folded neatly over his chest, as if he had arranged himself with care. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling. But it was his face that made Dalton stagger back, a hand flying to his mouth as he fought the urge to vomit. Augustus's face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. His mouth was open in a silent scream, his eyes stretched wide, the whites visible all around the irises. His skin had taken on a pale ashen gray, and deep scratches marked his neck, as though he had clawed at himself in his final moments. Dalton approached slowly, his heart pounding. He reached out and touched Augustus's hand. It was cold, rigid. Augustus Thornwell was dead. The servant who had come with Dalton fled the room, shouting for help. Within minutes, the household descended into chaos. Dr. Whitfield was summoned at once. Judge Beaumont and Catherine were notified. Word spread to the parish with astonishing speed. Dr. Whitfield arrived within the hour. He examined Augustus's body carefully, searching for any sign of violence or poison. He found none. Augustus's heart had simply stopped. The official cause of death, as recorded by Dr. Whitfield, was cardiac failure, likely brought on by extreme stress and exhaustion. But even Dr. Whitfield could not explain the expression on Augustus's face. In all his years of practice, he had never seen anything like it. It was as if Augustus had died in the grip of unimaginable fear, as though he had seen something in his final moments that had literally frightened him to death. The undertaker, a man named Mr. Finch, was called to prepare the body. When Mr. Finch arrived and saw Augustus's face, he refused to work alone. He insisted that 2 assistants remain with him in the room, and even then he worked as quickly as possible, his hands shaking. "I've never seen anything like it," Mr. Finch later told his wife. It was as if he died looking straight at the devil. Catherine was devastated. She had loved Augustus despite everything, and his death felt like a cruel, senseless twist of fate. She could not bring herself to view the body. Judge Beaumont did, and when he emerged from the room, he was pale and shaken, refusing to speak about what he'd seen. The funeral was held 2 days later, on June 21st, the day after what would have been the wedding. The irony was not lost on anyone. The same guests who had been invited to celebrate Augustus's marriage now gathered to mourn his burial. The same flowers ordered for the ceremony adorned his coffin. Augustus was laid to rest in the family plot on the Thornwell estate, beside his father. The service was brief. Few words were spoken. A deep unease hung over the gathering, a sense that something unnatural had occurred, though no one dared say it aloud. Ruth attended the funeral, standing at the back with the other servants. She watched as Augustus's coffin was lowered into the ground and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no relief, no sorrow, only emptiness. After the funeral, Catherine left Louisiana. She could not remain in Belle Rive Parish. The memories were too heavy. She moved to Charleston to live with relatives and never married. For the rest of her life, she refused to speak Augustus Thornwell's name or discuss what had happened to him. Judge Beaumont quietly arranged for the Thornwell estate to be sold. The new owners, a family from Georgia, knew nothing of the property's history. They moved into the manor house in the fall of 1848, full of optimism and plans for the future. They did not stay long. Within 6 months, they reported strange occurrences: footsteps in empty rooms, doors that would not stay closed, cold spots that appeared without explanation. The wife claimed she saw a figure standing in the garden at night, watching the house. The husband dismissed it as imagination, but even he could not deny the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to seep into every corner of the place. They sold the estate in 1849 and returned to Georgia. The Thornwell Manor changed hands several more times over the next 2 decades, but no one stayed for long. By the 1870s, it had been abandoned, left to decay slowly beneath the Louisiana sun. The story of Augustus Thornwell and his mysterious death became local legend in Belle Rive Parish. People whispered about it in taverns and parlors, each retelling adding new details, new interpretations. Some said it was divine punishment for his cruelty. Others insisted it was a tragic end of a man who worked himself to death. A few, usually late at night in lowered voices, suggested that Samuel's words had been a true curse, that some promises spoken in desperation carry a power that reaches beyond death. The truth, as so often, is impossible to know with certainty. The medical evidence pointed to heart failure brought on by stress. Augustus had been under immense pressure, had barely slept or eaten in weeks, and had consumed excessive amount of alcohol and laudanum. It is entirely plausible that his body simply gave out, that his heart failed under the accumulated strain. And yet, the timing is difficult to ignore. Samuel had said Augustus would not see his wedding day, and Augustus died the day before his wedding, dressed in his wedding suit, as if preparing for a ceremony he would never attend. Was it coincidence? A self-fulfilling prophecy? Or something else entirely? Years later, Dr. Whitfield wrote privately about the case in his journal. He noted that he had never seen a patient deteriorate so rapidly from nervous exhaustion, and he admitted he could not fully explain Augustus's symptoms or his death. There are aspects of the human mind and body that remain mysteries to medical science, he wrote. Perhaps Augustus Thornwell's guilt manifested in physical symptoms that ultimately killed him. Or perhaps there are forces in this world that we do not yet understand. Ruth lived another 30 years after Samuel's death. She eventually gained her freedom after the Civil War and moved to New Orleans, where she worked as a seamstress. She rarely spoke of her time on the Thornwell plantation, but in her final years, a neighbor once asked her whether she believed Samuel's words had killed Augustus Thornwell. Ruth was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I believe that some debts must be paid one way or another. Whether it was Samuel's spirit or Augustus's own conscience that ended his life, I cannot say. But he died exactly as Samuel said he would, and perhaps that is justice enough." The Thornwell Manor stood empty for decades, slowly crumbling into ruin. The fields were eventually absorbed by neighboring plantations. The quarters where Samuel, Ruth, and Grace had lived were torn down, the wood reused for other buildings, leaving no trace that they had ever been there at all. Existed, but the story endured. In the 1920s, a historian researching plantation life in Louisiana stumbled across references to the Thornwell case in old parish records and private correspondence. He attempted to dig deeper, only to discover that many of the most relevant documents had been lost, destroyed, or deliberately removed over time. What remained were fragments, a death certificate, several letters Catherine had written to her family, entries from Dr. Whitfield's personal journal, and oral testimony passed down by descendants of people who had been there. The historian published a short article in a regional history journal, outlining the strange circumstances surrounding Augustus Thornwell's death and the stubborn local legends that refused to fade. He concluded that while the supernatural aspects were almost certainly folklore, the psychological dimensions of the case were compelling and deserved closer examination. Today, the site where the Thornwell Manor House once stood is nothing more than an empty field, overgrown with weeds and young trees. There is no marker, no plaque, no sign that anything of consequence ever happened there. The burial plot where Samuel and Grace were laid to rest has long since vanished. The wooden crosses rotted away, and the exact location was forgotten. But locals say that on certain nights, when the moon is full and the air is perfectly still, if you stand in that field and listen closely, you can hear footsteps moving through the grass. Slow, dragging footsteps, as if someone is walking with great difficulty. And if you're brave enough to remain, they say you might hear a voice, soft, hoarse, repeating the same 7 words over and over again. You will not see your wedding day. Is it only the wind, the shifting of the earth, the power of suggestion acting on minds shaped by old stories? Or is it something else entirely? Something that refuses to be forgotten, a promise spoken in desperation that continues to echo across years? The answer, like so much about this story, depends on what you choose to believe. What do you think? Do you believe Augustus Thornwell died from guilt and overwhelming stress? Or was there something more at work? Do you think Samuel's words carried a power beyond the natural world? Or was it all coincidence and psychology? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this dark chapter of American history, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share this story with someone who loves mysteries that blur the line between history and horror. There are more stories like this waiting to be told, more secrets buried in the past, waiting to be uncovered. See you in the next one.